Hello, class. Let's see here. I want to get everyone's names to make sure that you get your extra credit points. All right. So Christina and Priscilla. Miss Kimberly. Let's see here. And then including myself, I believe that's the four currently. So I have you three ladies. I have your names. So that's great. Thank you for being here today. So we're going to jump right into this week's assignment. Okay. So this week's assignment is on the West in the antebellum period. Antebellum just meaning before the war, before the Civil War. So primarily the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And so what we're looking at in the first one, right, is I take a very kind of controversial thesis about the West by a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner. And what he does is he tries to make the argument that the West makes us who we are as a country, that the West symbolizes what America stands for. And what America supposedly stands for, according to Turner, is meritocracy. You get what you merit, you get what you earn, what you work for, right? And the idea of meritocracy is that there's equality of opportunity, that there's no favoritism, there's no inherent nobility system or anything like that, and that it's fair. It hits our notion of equity or fairness as a nation. And so in arguing that, he tries to contend that the West was an equalizer, right? It put everyone on equal footing. That in the East Coast, he claims, the English under the colonial period, etc., they tried their best at different times to enact a sort of aristocracy, an elite group that had privileges over other people. But he says in the West, it gave everybody a clean slate. Uh, so that whole idea of kind of an empty frontier, you got to be careful with that, right? Because that's easy justification for taking over land that was inhabited for centuries or longer than that, millennia, by Native Americans, for instance. So, like I said, there are some holes in this thesis. There are a lot of serious historians today. They feel like they can pick and choose some nuggets from this thesis, but overall, the argument is and to them is not very credible. Um, but still, I thought it was thought provoking enough to and famous enough to put it in here. And so the two categories that I noticed from his work, right, that seemed to he tended to focus on in the West becoming an equalizer, leveling the playing field, are dangers and opportunities. All right, because if the dangers are indiscriminate, if the dangers do not discriminate as far as what your last name is, what social or economic background you come from, what ethnicity you have and come from, then he might have somewhat of an argument there, right? That the West is leveling conditions for everyone, and then of course the same thing with opportunities. All right, so getting into this, I try to give examples from his work of both of those, right? And so you find evidence of just the ecosystems themselves, right? The rivers, the Snake, the Columbia, the Platte, these other rivers, right? It has been notated that a lot of people, a lot of livestock, horses, wagons, etc., were lost in those rivers. It's just apparently is a cited fact. Accidents and disease tend to have been primarily the most prevalent ways in which people lost their lives or came to much harm. So cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever, etc. Those ran rampant in the 1830s through 1850s. And and then, of course, the fact that you're going through Native American territory, and as you recall from the War of 1812, and from the episode leading in through the Trail of Tears and the Jacksonian period, is there had been many instances when it was a regional territory. It was under people like William Henry Harrison, placed as a provisional governor. Different military authorities, civilian authorities, as well as just civilians, would oftentimes pick and choose from whom they would buy land or make a deal amongst Native Americans. And of course, they chose those who were willing, who were most amenable to their offers. And so hence those, sometimes you could cynically state, those who were who had a price tag and were able to be bribed. And so it happened so often, right, that there were expressions in the Algonquian and other native tribal tongues saying, you know, do not touch the pin. If you touch the white man's pin, according to some tribes, it was worthy of the death penalty. And so my point being, right, is that's going to add to the hostility and the ambiguity, the unclearness of Native American claims to their territory, whereby settlers are going to come through and say, no, wait a minute, there's been a treaty. There was the Medicine Lodge Treaty, the Fort Laramie treaties, the Treaty of New Eshota, all these different treaties, whereby it entailed in one degree or another transfer, or at least, if not transfer of Native American territory, at least the guarantee of safe passage of white settlers coming through their territory. But again, if you're amongst the natives who never gave your consent, who never touched the white man's pen, then that agreement to you is not binding. And then, of course, another stereotypical dichotomy in the tribes that also tended to go along the lines of generation or age are those who are rising up in their tribes militarily versus the civilian sage, like, you know, for like the elders who are known for their older age and wisdom, oftentimes maternal connections to a matriarch of the tribe. They tended to be more accommodating to the paleface, to the white man, and the young warriors tended to be less accommodating. And so sometimes they would split, and half their tribe would be okay with something and the other half would not. So at any rate, for those and other reasons, when people started going across, and I think I have a map for you to look to on the second page of the Overland Trails, that's a lot of different tribal territories that those 2,000-mile paths traversed. So, for instance, up in the Montana area, in the Dakotas and the Montana area, you have the Blackfeet, of course the Lakota or the Sioux, the Crow and the Shoshone, these other tribes going into California. They were known to attack settlers that came in through their territory. And if not outright attack, at least extort. They would hold them pretty much at gunpoint and say, we want this and this from you. We want your horses, or etc. Right? If not, we're going to attack you. And so this was a common phenomenon that was cited amongst it, especially those, right, those trips that were the most publicized. There was a guy named Robert Stewart who came from the Oregon Territory during the War of 1812 to notify the American government that the British were not recognizing Astoria after John Jacob Astor, our little fur trading company there in the Oregon Territory. And on his trip there, all the stereotypical things that usually you dramatically have heard about across the Oregon Trail, were publicized from his case. At one point, the guys were, I know this is gross, but the guys became so deprived of, they were so thirsty, so deprived of water that they drank their own urine. At one point, they even began to consider drawing sticks as to whom to kill and cook and eat because they were so hungry. I mean, that's dramatic, crazy stuff, right? And of course, they were extorted by the Crow and lost a lot of their supplies by them at gunpoint. And so a lot of that stuff, right, comes from these famous cases like Robert Stewart, who make it to Missouri, and they wanted fame and they wanted money, and they sold the rights to sit down with a newspaper journalist or writer and tell their story. And that writer, of course, would make a lot of money writing a book about that person's trip. So that happened with more than a handful of Americans, and they usually had stories like that. And so people literally, they dealt with their wills and so forth. They made all the preparatory. Uh, they engaged in all the preparatory actions that suggested that they were well aware of the fact that they may not make it all the way there, much less back. So at any rate, that's one thing that he does is he goes over these dangers, and notice that the dangers are supposed to be indiscriminate. And then if they're indiscriminate, right, it's not only fair for everyone, right, but it's also, I think of Joseph Campbell. He's an intellectual who looks at different philosophies and religions of the world, and he finds common themes that he finds to be prevalent that are shared amongst them despite all their differences. And one of them that he speaks about and writes about is the hero's journey, right? The idea of kind of like a protagonist in a literary novel. Uh, that person is has a lot of faults. I think of like a long time ago in college, reading the Odyssey, right? The Greco work, the Odyssey, and Odysseus is very arrogant and very selfish and kind of narcissistic in the beginning of the book, and he goes through all kinds of trials and tribulation, and he breaks down and weeps in one dramatic, actually I think more than one case, and he's humbled, he's broken, and he makes it through, and he defeats the suitors that are in his home and are abusing his son, and etc. And it ends well, right? And so the notion is that it's romanticized reaching the American dream, all the more if achieving the American dream is very dangerous and difficult. And so it makes it more romantic, right? And so that's part of his thesis. And really, he applies. It's kind of funny to use the word romantic and then shortly thereafter use the adjective Darwinian, because I wouldn't say a lot of people would say that Darwinian theory is romantic, but at any rate, he does kind of use a little bit Darwinian undergirding theory that the weak, the unlucky, they die out, they're weeded out through this tough process of moving to the West, and those who were tough, who were quick on their feet to adapt and improvise in their given situations, and are tenacious and don't give up, and let's face it, are a little bit just lucky. He says those are the ones that achieve the American dream. And the fact that it doesn't matter what their ethnicity is, what their socioeconomic background was in the East Coast, he says that's what makes it a sense of fairness and so forth. And it's what makes America what it is. So it symbolizes, quote, Americana. Okay. So at any rate, you see the dangers, and then not to mention also the there are time periods in which the West was a little bit technically anarchic, without government, without legal institutions, and because remember, a lot of the Western states like Wyoming, etc., and into the further west did not become states until the 1860s and 1870s. So a lot of them were informally just territorial status, not guaranteed a Republican form of government, and a lot of them had yet to go through the process mandated by the Northwest ordinances that we're supposed to follow to this day when we purchase or gain territory. And that's a very methodical process, right? Whereby the land survey office comes, they put everything in 6 square acre plots. That's why when you're in an airplane, you see like the squares on the landscape, right? They're supposed to put everything in 6 acre square plots. So many of those are to constitute a town. So many of those are to constitute a county, and so many of those will constitute later a state. You get to an exact number. It was 60,000 for a while. as far as your population. Then they have a referendum and they elect delegates. The delegates have a convention. At the convention, they write a constitution. It cannot contradict anything in the federal constitution. It's sent to Congress. Then they approve of it. And when they do, then you become a state. You're guaranteed, the rights of Republican form of government, the protection of life, liberty, and property, and all that. So in the meantime, when you're in that kind of limbo stage, right, you could have primary source evidence of things getting a little crazy. And so, especially like with the gold rush, President Polk deliberately kind of threw the Northwest ordinances aside. Because remember, we win. I hate to use that term win. I'm going to go like this when I say win, okay? Because it was robbery. It was theft. Arguably, the U.S. picked a fight with Mexico in 1846, and then took several Western states from her in 1848. Well, we took those states from them in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2nd, 1848. Gold was discovered, right, when they were trying to split the American River, and thereby double the pressure of that river water and current to push the turbines of a sawmill. That's when they found gold in the bed of the river. They found that on January 24th. And so February 8th or February 2nd, that's only 8 days later. So literally in the last 8 days of the war, gold was discovered and announced in California, right? And so the timing couldn't have been worse for the Californios, the Hispanic Californians. In the famous year of 1849, the 49ers, right, over 80,000 were registered coming across the Oregon Trail alone. And so the people are just going to flood into this area, right? And so when that happens, the Northwest ordinances were disregarded. Mexican government, of course, had jurisdiction of pueblos, of cities and little towns. They had a state government and state legislator with a governor, right? But that immediately was eradicated, and it wasn't recognized by our government. And so, so right away, right, it's like we reverted to a state of anarchy. And not to mention, in a lot of the mining towns, right, when you go up like present day 108 up into Sonora and Angels Camp, etc., and Murphy's, those had not been established as bona fide cities or towns. So at any rate, when gold was discovered, people flooded in, and there were no sheriff departments, there were no police departments, there were no municipal mayors and counselors. Because remember, there were mayors and city councils in the actual pueblos, but most the Spanish and Mexican cities and towns, the pueblos were along the coast, not into the foothills, where the gold would be discovered along the American and Feather rivers, etc., and Consumnes, etc. So at any rate, when people came in, it kind of reverted to a barbaric kind of might makes right environment, where settlers came in, and they would something as simple as putting a shovel with their hat in a certain area to claim that land, to mine that area. And then what happens when 10 to 20 miners show up who are well armed, and they say, "We don't recognize your claim." They knock your shovel over, and they point guns at you and tell you to get out, that it's their claim now and not yours. So that's going to happen for a while until the miners start congregating together and forming miners associations or miners clubs. And basically, their term today, almost nothing short of vigilante groups. And so they would have their own process by which they would try someone, but oftentimes if they found the person guilty, they would hang the person without a single deputized person present. And so this happens during the gold rush. There's evidence for it. Um, you have towns in the West, like in New Mexico and other areas. There was a town called Baxter, a town called Caldwell, and they were so tired of roaming cowboys coming in and wreaking havoc on the town that they deputized every inhabitant in their town and gave them authority to shoot on the spot an incoming cowboy into their town. And so you definitely have evidence of stuff like that. You have evidence of deputies and marshals being very understaffed. And there was a famous judge. They called him the hanging judge. And I apologize, I don't have my notes here to recall his name at the moment. But he literally would send people into California. And in one infamous case, he said, well, basically, where there's smoke, there's fire. Most of these men have been on a suspect list for quite some time, so they're likely guilty of something. And so, because we don't have enough deputies and others, if they try to resist, just shoot them on the spot, and then just let me know, mark it down on a list, and it'll be a job well done. And so, you do have evidence for the West being exceptionally lawless, right? Which might lend a little bit to Turner's thesis of it being indiscriminately dangerous. And then later on in your 102 class, you have evidence of like with the cow towns, where the railroads would take people bringing in cows that would sell at one point for $75 back then a piece, which was a huge moneymaker. The mining towns, needless to say, right, where people would congregate. Then you had all kinds of entertainment services that were offered them, and that you had lots of trouble in those areas. As they would try to find people who were known to be quick at the draw with their gun, to be hired, like Wild Bill Hickok and others who would be hired to try to implement law and order. So at any rate, you do have evidence that if you wanted to pick and choose to support Turner's thesis of there being allegedly indiscriminate dangers in the West. And then, of course, opportunities. And the opportunities, as you see, the primary one that I think of is entrepreneurial, starting a business of some sort, right? That if you see a demand of any sort amongst those that you are traveling with to the West, and you supply that demand, bam, it was that simple. So the term mining the miners, right? A lot of people made more money simply selling goods and products and services to the miners than they ever did going into a mine trying to find gold. So of course this lends to the rough and rowdy depiction of the West. And the gold rush, right? At one point, from 1848 to about 1852, they have fairly well documented. They think anywhere between 89 and 95% of those who came initially were men. It was the gender imbalance was that pronounced. And so, of course, you had prostitution and entertainment of other sorts. You had gambling houses and other in theaters and restaurants. People hired to wash your clothes, et cetera, right? Some of the things, just the seemingly most mundane things, people made lots of money doing that. Having an inn, buying a multi-storied building or renting it, and then renting out, 5 to 10 rooms and charging by the night. Just simple things like that could earn you a great income in the West. The Mormons were famous for simply their ferry services, right? Across certain dangerous rivers, they created a ferry system, especially with a lot of people traveling in the famous Conestoga wagons that couldn't make it through those rivers. They would just say, hey, for this much. And if memory serves me correctly, oftentimes with all their supplies and everything, they would oftentimes charge just $2 a family to get across that river. but that adds up, right? When you charge hundreds of people a week to make it across that river. And so there was a guy named Sam Brannan that I mentioned in there, right? And Sam Brannan was known for mining the miners in a very simplistic way. Is he got his hands on the majority of available in California available mining equipment, and then sold it to the would-be miners when they got here. And so those are just some examples of indiscriminate, or not, yeah, I guess indiscriminate, supposedly, opportunities, right? That it didn't matter what your family name was, ethnicity, etc. That if you were quick on your feet, you could make money doing these things. And then, of course, when you look at the Alta California, the Despierta, and a couple other Mexican Spanish language newspapers in 1848, you find evidence of them boasting and showing great surprise at the ease with which the early comers to the gold mines were finding and enriching themselves from gold. And notice also that they contended that it did not require any capital. You didn't need any fancy machinery. You didn't need any technical skill or education, right? But that literally they were finding it on the riverbeds and right at the superficial level. So they ended up calling that placer, right? Placer, placer level gold. So in 1848, those who initially came here enriched themselves, and it didn't matter where they were from, right? Matter of fact, a lot of the early recipients of this who beat the people from the East Coast to the punch were Sonorans and Sinaloans from Mexico. And of course, there was great resentment against that, but they beat a lot of the crowd to the punch, as did even the Chileans from South America, and who did very well. They were used to using mercury, for instance, to discern between fool's gold and real gold, and they were very well adept at mining from their own experiences. So, at any rate, um, let's see here. So you have entrepreneurial opportunities, you have mineral wealth that can be extracted, right? As examples of his thesis that opportunities arose. And then of course, you're also going to have the opportunity to become a cash crop farmer, right? Instead of a subsistence farmer who just subsists or survives on his own crop, you sell it, right, to a market for profit. And so this happens and is available largely from the Jacksonian period. And remember, we talked about this last week, how there was a tendency amongst the politicians to try to cater to their voters, to win their votes. And one of the easiest, surest ways of doing that was providing cheap or even free land and allowing them to trespass on the land, squat on it, and claim that no one else is occupying it, that they're cultivating and proving it, and hence a judge recognizes it as their own. And so at any rate, that was a quick way. And not to mention in the 1820s and 30s, you have a great growth in turnpikes or toll roads, also canals, right? By the 1840s, you have the widespread beginning of railroads. And of course, by the 1880s and 90s, the railroads are going to connect all throughout the West so that you could go upon land, squat on it, grow a crop, uh, cultivate it, and then trade it at the nearest train depot and have it sent to a market to be sold. And so it especially applies to your History 102 class as infrastructure grows in the mid to late 1800s. So that was another area and manner by which people could achieve the American dream, and supposedly irrespective of their background. All right. Um, any questions on that or any comments? Sure. Okay, let's see here. I have also Andrea. I'll make sure I have everyone here, and Amanda. Good, good. All right, so number two, right? as I often do rather predictably, is I kind of take a 180, don't I? And I say, I don't know about this Turner's thesis, right? I sure as heck don't know about this equality of opportunity. And so what I try to do is I try to lay a foundation in the cultural realm, right? As a lot of times historians divide history into social, political, and economic categories, looking at the social or cultural element and say, okay, first of all, there's a lot of evidence of racism in the mid 1800s, right? Particularly against Hispanics and Hispanic Americans. And I hope no one's too touchy about the way that I will interchangeably use the term Latino and Hispanic. Okay, Hispanic technically just applies to Hispania, to Spain, of Spanish speaking and Spanish culture. So it probably technically would be more appropriate to use the term Latino, as of course Mexican American demographically, biologically, culturally, historically, have had a lot of integration between this from the time of the Spanish conquistadores through the Aztec and other indigenous people, right? So at any rate, with the Latinos, I try to give evidence from politicians, newspapers, etc., right, to show the manner by which they looked down upon them. They were condescending. They had negative stereotypes about them, etc., right? And then, of course, I try to suggest that there was a great scale of coveting their land, right? Of enviously looking at their land and desiring it, especially in eastern Texas and California. The depictions of those areas from the settlers making it back to the States and going into the press depicted eastern Texas and California as almost, utopian, like these great paradise areas. And so there was a guy named Richard Henry Dana, Dana, who wrote a book called 7 Years at the Mast. And it was a autobiographical book, and with a lot of observations of Mexican California when he was there through the Navy. And he boasts of how beautiful the land is, how wonderful the climate is, uh, how quaint the culture is, and hospitable the people are. But then he takes a very racist, condescending turn and says, boy, just imagine if this wonderful land were in the hands of a more enterprising people. And that's going to be a common stereotype that the Anglo Americans, right, or WASP Americans coming from more English extraction are going to hold for themselves, is that they are more hardworking, they're more innovative economically, that they're embracing the new changes of the times, that they're constantly at work and incorporating their area into the markets nearby and far away, etc., right? And they're bringing economic progress to their area. And there was this notion, which is so ironic, right? So many times you find a seeming contradiction, a paradox, and stereotypes of different people, right? And it's not going to be long after the Mexican American War to the time which we are going to primarily utilize Latino labor, right, and contend that they work very productively, very efficiently, that they're docile, right, that they like the same stereotypes we'll have of Asian immigrants during the time of the gold rush in the mid 1800s, right? That they're the ideal worker to exploit or take advantage of because they work quickly, they work thoroughly, and they do what they're told until the end of the day. But you also had the semi simultaneous idea of the Mexican, of the lazy Mexican, who is not doing anything with his land, is not enterprising, and is not bringing California in line with the modern economic trends of the time. And so hence, it goes back to the 1600s when the English and Spanish did to the Native Americans, right? The Spanish called it empty land, tierra vacía. The English called it virgin soil. They said, hey, the Native Americans aren't cultivating the land. They're not making good use of it. They're not trading in commodities. Therefore, their economies are primitive, and so therefore we have the right to take the land and make better use of it. You have that same type of stereotype against Mexican authorities in Texas, in New Mexico, in California, etc. Right? That their economies are largely archaic from a bygone period, right? And so, for instance, in New Mexico and in California, there were a lot of ranches that were pastoral, right, where they just had roaming sheep or cattle. And so on that land, when you come and look, especially if it's a large land grant, because remember, you had family, you could look up families like the Nietos. Um, what's another family name down there in Southern California? The only one that's coming to me right now is the Nieto family, right? Like grandson. Um, but at any rate, the average rancher would have thousands of acres because oftentimes the Spanish and later Mexican governors only gave out hundreds of land grants, and just hundreds, under 1,000. That's not very much for the size of California, right? But a lot of those who were granted land were granted lots of it, and they became pastoral. That was a big moneymaker for them. So when you're coming from the outside, right? And again, I think of like driving along Highway 108 up into Sonora. You see all these rolling hills and you see some random animals grazing, and you think to yourself, well, who really owns this, right? Is it public domain? Is it privately owned? But they don't tend to have anything fenced off, right? And so that was the notion when they came into many parts of California, these Anglo miners coming into the gold rush, is they would see this land and it looked luxurious. The climate was great, comparable to other states, right? And and they think, wow, it's not really being cultivated. We don't know who it's inhabited or claimed by. So they began just squatting on the land and like moths eating up clothing, little piece by little piece. They began taking little parcels of land from the rich rancheros, the Latino owners, right, or Hispanic owners. A lot of them, in this case, were proud of being purely of Spanish heritage in California. But at any rate, they then they would have to go to court, right? And then in 1850 and 1851, we established laws. The new Anglo-California government established laws making it a very tedious, difficult task to prove your land ownership in a court. And so they wanted latitude and longitude lines. They wanted signatures of the governing authorities in La Fecha, the date of when it was established. And so they deliberately made it tough for the Hispanic landowners to prove their ownership. And then not to mention, right, we're talking about, the Sacred Expedition was 1769. That had been a long time ago. And so in some cases, it was rather, you know, uh, what's the word I'm thinking of? Informal, where they would say, okay, we want you to go ahead and have this land. And they say, okay, well, how much of it? How about from the stack of rocks to that tree? What happens when the stack of rocks is no longer there or the tree is uprooted, right? And so oftentimes they certainly couldn't prove the exact boundaries that they had claimed to. And so at any rate, all this made it tough for the Hispanic landowners and the people coming in just like sharks trying to take up little parcels of their land. But not only was this happening in other parts of the country, like I said, and a lot of these poor, ambitious people were claiming squatters' rights, and it wouldn't have mattered who owned that land. But you also definitely have an element to which, like I said, in the popular press, in letters written back to loved ones, of racist assumptions, condescending racist assumptions, saying that these Latino people were backward anyway and were not economically enterprising and were hence not worthy of holding on to that land. And so racism definitely played a part, right? You see, anybody have any questions as far as the circumstances of the loss of Texas? Did I make that narrative amply clear as far as just kind of the chain of events that happened? So 1824, Stephen Austin gets permission from the Mexican governor to establish a colony, right? And it was San Felipe de Austin. He brought in originally about 300 Anglo settlers. All they had to do was claim loyalty to the Mexican government and to the Mexican Constitution. They were to learn Spanish, become Roman Catholic, and abide by Mexican law. Well, already in that very year, in 1824, Mexico prohibited slavery. So within 3 years, they're going to defy and protest against that, claiming they have a right to bring their slaves with them, because demographically, the majority of these settlers came from the South, because Texas is in the South, right? So they came from nearby Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and even above them, right, coming from Tennessee, Kentucky, that's still culturally considered the South. And so they're primarily Southerners coming in with their Southern prejudices, right? And so they come in by 1827. They made demands on the state legislator to make a compromise with slaves, so that they could not have any slaves born there, but any ones that they had already brought, they could keep for a certain number of years under their services, etc. And they only did this in Texas. Everywhere else, they'd already made it established that we're done with slavery in Mexico, right? Technically, they already could have someone elected into the state legislature in Saltillo, Coahuila, because remember, Texas and Coahuila were united as one state. And so they technically could be represented down in Saltillo, Coahuila. They were exempt from taxes for 6 years. But then you had Mier y Terán and Mr. Sanchez come up, and they gave a very grim picture back to Mexico of this Anglo colony in 1830, 6 years later, right? And stated that, okay, first of all, the ratio is like at least 80 to 20 Anglos over Hispanics. They are no longer assimilating and becoming Spanish-speaking Roman Catholics. They're not intermarrying with the Hispanic families like they had been in the first few years. And they seem to be oftentimes, the word was haughty, kind of arrogantly defiant, and kind of did as they pleased. 1831, those 6 years had passed, right, of being exempt from taxes. And there was a place called Anahuac, Anahuac. And so the Mexican authorities came up there and for the first time started to collect taxes from these Anglo settlers. And the Anglo settlers protested, and it ended in armed violence. And they had to bring a presidio, a fort of soldiers there to Anahuac. So in many cases, right? And then, of course, you had the brothers who tried to break free and form what they called Fredonia, right? And Austin, who was in charge, along with Mexican authorities, had to squash that revolt. And so it seemed like by all the indicators that this Anglo colony was defiant from the very get-go, out for themselves alone, and not a very trustworthy demographic for Mexico there in eastern Texas, right? And so then you had the establishment under Bustamante of the April 6th colonization law of 1830. And they said, okay, you can no longer have slaves, and also you can no more gringo immigration, at least for the time being. And so Austin came down to protest this and try to speak on behalf of the Eastern Texans to try to gain some type of compromise. And when he did, right, Bustamante had been overthrown by Gomez Farias. Gomez Farias didn't have very good chemistry, he and Austin. Both of them very intellectual and very proud people. And at any rate, Austin pretty much tells him, right, if you don't come to terms with us, we're just going to break free, and I won't be able to stop it, he said. The people in my colony will break free. And Gomez Farias contends that that was a treasonous threat. And so he put Austin in prison for 15 months. And while he was in prison, Austin, after several months, became very despondent and lost all hope. Not to mention, Mexico had had many abrupt changes, right, in the late 1820s and early 1830s. Bustamante and Guerrero both claim that they won the presidential election. Bustamante then uses the army to chase after and capture Guerrero and has him publicly executed. Bustamante's in there just for a couple years, writes his own very conservative constitution, and then he's overthrown, and Gomez Farias comes in. Gomez Farias is super liberal. He's the one who secularizes the missions, takes the powers and privileges away from the Catholic Church, takes powers away from the armed forces, starts a public school system, and has all these liberal reforms. And then there is a conservative revolution to overthrow him. And then Santa Anna comes in, and then Santa Anna, as you see in this write-up, issues the famous 7 laws, the Siete Leyes Constitution, that was very conservative. And he doesn't last too long, and he himself will be overthrown. So Mexico had a very tumultuous early history. And part of that, I think, was because they're, unlike here in the US, their left and their right were rather far apart. Their left wanted complete citizenship for all men, sorry, not ladies yet, but all men, including indigenous, mestizo, right, half European, half Native American. They wanted land redistribution, right? They wanted very democratic government. And so they were further to the left than our left guys, I would argue. And then the right was uber right. They wanted an emperor. Iturbide called himself Emperor Iturbide the First. They wanted the ability of this executive to shut down Congress, their diputación at will, very much further to the right. So when one group won an election, it did seem to be more like the end of the world to the other side, catastrophic, right? And they would refuse to recognize that election result and fight instead. So that just gave another excuse to the Anglo-Americans, right? Saying, well, look, these Mexican people, they're tumultuous as people, right? The idea of the passionate Mexican, right? That they can't hold their temper, that they're too passionate, they have no self-control, and they're fighting amongst one another constantly, right? And so hence they're not worthy of keeping this land anyway. And so that was just one more reason for which Americans could excuse taking lands from Mexico. And so when Austin sees all that drama, when he's in prison down in Mexico City, and he was treated as such by Gomez Farias, he finally, in a despondent mood, gives up, because he was proud of the fact that he had assimilated to Mexican culture and shot down the Fredonian revolt and upheld his loyalty to Mexico. Had written several reports asking for more Mexican troops and policemen to help him police his area, contending that his own people were defiant, but he wasn't okay with that, and he was unable to control them. But now he sends a famous letter to the Cabildo, the city council of San Antonio, and says, guys, I've tried to reason with Mexico, and they're beyond reasoning, and they're corrupt and out of control down here. Just do whatever you deem necessary. And that's when the war hawks like Sam Houston and William Barrett Travis kind of took control of this movement, right? And so to a lot of people, the 7 laws constitution of Santa Anna was more of a convenient excuse than anything when they were established around 1835. And in that right, it was very, like I put in here, uber conservative. The president had the power to shut down his own Congress. He now would handpick the governors. He did away with the state legislators, and the state legislators were the elected reps who passed the laws in the states, right? And the governors were elected in virtually all the states of Mexico, and he did an end to that. The state militias were now incorporated by the president under the federal army. So if you had any notions of libertarianism, right, of a fearful, healthy, in your mind at least, distrust of central government, this was scary. This was anathema, right? And a lot of these Southerners did. They came from a libertarian background. And so in the Alamo, the most common flag or protest literature that was found amongst those who were killed by Santa Anna's Mexican army at the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas, was return to the Constitution of 1824. Uh, but of course, one grand exception, right, is the Constitution of 1824 outlawed slavery, and they wanted to keep their slaves. So that obviously was, a stretch there. But everything else about the 1824 Constitution they loved, right? And why wouldn't they? Because it was very federal. It gave a lot of wiggle room to the states to have their own elected assemblies, their own elected governors, to make their own laws as long as they didn't contradict that of the central government. I mean, does this sound familiar, you guys? It was modeled largely after the American federal government, federal republic. And so, at any rate, and in fairness to the complexity of things, you could look up a father and son, Erasmo and Juan Seguin, Seguin. And there were at one given time, there was a coalition that met in Saltillo in defiance of this seven laws constitution. And about, I would say, I'm trying to recall my studies, but I want to say almost 40% of them were Tejanos, were ethnic Mexicans. And so there were ethnic Mexicans who were protested Santa Anna and this new super conservative constitution, so that there was limitedly simply a political dimension to this protest, that it was, libertarians fighting against a heavily centralized, almost dictatorial president, right? Um, but like I said in this handout, right, when William Barrett Travis and the Alamo was being attacked, and he writes a circular to be given to the newspapers and to enlist American help, it is very racist in its tone. And it says basically that, right, that we're fighting against a very degraded and backward people and country. And please, liberty loving Anglo Americans, come and free this beautiful land and put it under a people more worthy of it. And so, you know what I mean? He made it into a very ethnically conscious rebellion. And so, and then even as they fought, right, they told the Mexican blood rebels that they had to wear special hats and jackets to delineate them from the Mexican soldiers who were fighting against them, etc. Right, and from the get go after San Jacinto, what they did to win is they waited until Santa Anna put his three armies together. And it was kind of the notion of like Sun Tzu, the art of war. You not only hit the enemy where he's weak, but you hit him where he knows he's strong, because he'll be arrogant and put his guard down. And that's what happened. Santa Anna joined all three of his armies. And literally the morning of that of the day after, they'd all gotten together and lit fires and celebrated and drank, etc., because their numbers were so great, putting those three armies together. And they came in the pre-dawn hours and surprised them, literally caught Santa Anna sleeping in his tent and captured him and said, "Your life or Texas." And so almost immediately they made it clear that they were distrustful of any ethnic Mexican American people. And so it didn't take long for the Seguin family and others, right, to literally leave Texas, because they felt the ethnic tension so strongly and felt like it certainly, if it ever started as a political protest, it no longer was just that, but that it was something bigger and darker as far as having ethnic overtones. Okay. So any questions on that with Texas? All right. And I'm pretty brief with the Mexico one, right? But remember, Tyler, the guy who was a lame duck president, so he had nothing to gain and nothing to lose. He'd already been, elected out of office. He asked Congress to annex or accept the Republic of Texas as a new state. So remember, technically from 1836 to 1845, Texas was its own country, its own republic, right? And Mexico, the Congress thereof, made it very clear that they planned to retake Texas in time, that it was theirs. Santa Anna even had a statue of himself pointing toward Texas, contending he would eventually gain it back. And so the Mexican government made it clear to our government that if we tried to annex the Republic of Texas, it would mean war. And even someone as fiery and kind of populist as Andrew Jackson uh, would not take Mexico up on that dare. But Tyler would on his way out, and so would James K. Polk, a Tennessee kind of I wouldn't say parvenu like Andrew Jackson. He was kind of born into money, but he was of Scots-Irish origins. And so the same kind of culture as Andrew Jackson brought up there in the Tennessee area of the Waxhaw region, where you have those same type of populist stereotypes against other ethnic groups, etc. And so Polk, by virtually any litmus test you use by today's standards, was racist against Mexican people and Mexican Americans. And it seems pretty evident that he deliberately picked a fight with Mexico. He coveted California in particular, and he knew that it would be seen as an insult. Then he sent not one but two people down to Mexico to try to purchase California from them, and they basically said, "Leave." That's we're not cool with having that discourse on that subject. Um, it was clear from the Adams-Onis Treaty what the boundary of Texas would be with Mexico, with Coahuila beneath it, um, and he tried to contend that, well, you guys are no longer Spain, you're Mexico, so I don't recognize that boundary, and he tried to increase it, right? And the joke is, right, when you look at the Nueces River, which initially was the boundary, and then you take it down below that to the Rio Bravo del Norte, or we call it the Rio Grande, right? The land between that is some of the most barren land in North America. It doesn't yield crops worth a darn. There's nothing valuable about that land. And chances are Polk knew that. And it's all the more reason why today people contend that he was just simply looking for a fight. And so he sends men across the Nueces River to the Rio Bravo del Norte, to the Rio Grande. And so technically under the Adams-Onis Treaty, that they're in Mexican territory. And they were there for a few days. Actually, I think it might have been more like a week. And the Mexican army sent their guys, their cavalry, and then one of the American cavalry units went on a quote reconnaissance run, and no one knows who fired the first shot. And about 20 of our boys were shot off their horses and killed. And so Santa Anna goes to Congress and says, I've tried to reason with them. I just simply wanted to purchase California. I was willing to pay a good price for it. And they're being obstinate about Texas, claiming that we can't annex them, but the Republic of Texas wants just that. And that did make it more complex, as they did. Sam Houston, its governor or its president, and a lot of members of its legislature did want the perks of becoming an American state. And so, and then of course he says ultimately that American blood has been shed on American soil, with those boys being shot off their horses just above the Rio Grande. And so it passes. It was tighter in the Senate, but it passed both houses, and war was declared. And you have quotes from Ulysses Grant saying there was no more unjust war ever promulgated by the U.S. than the Mexican-American War. Abraham Lincoln said that Polk was a tyrant who was picking a fight in coveting Mexican land. Uh, uh, Henry David Thoreau refused to pay taxes that endorsed the war, and he ended up going to jail for it. And so that you had some some rather public protests, but they tended to be in the minority. And so, at any rate, the war was fought, was carried out. And then you could make the argument that the manner by which it was fought was rather emotionally laden and vicious. When you look at reports of atrocities on those who tried to surrender and on civilians. And of course, this is going to happen very cynically and sadly in virtually any war. But let's face it, there are some wars in which there is much more primary evidence for this phenomenon than others, right? And I think that arguably teaching US history, with the grand exception of some of the wars we had with Native Americans, particularly like if you look at Metacom's war up in New England, there were horrible atrocities toward just any Native American they found. But when you look at more external wars with people with contiguous, separate boundaries and separate countries, I would say that the Mexican-American War and the World War II in the Pacific theater against the Japanese really stand out as the salient cases where you have a lot of evidence of them fighting especially viciously and personally against one another. And so I tried to give a couple quotes there. You see the quote from Winfield Scott, right, saying that the atrocities that that Zachary Taylor's soldiers committed against Mexican women and Mexican civilians, he said would make heaven weep, and were worthy of being punished. Remember, Winfield Scott is going to establish tribunals to try some of his men, and he would have them publicly executed down in Mexico. Because remember, he took over Mexico City um, and conquered Mexico, and he would have public executions of his own soldiers. And in a way, some of it was pragmatic because he saw the retaliation by the Mexican civilians and people, right? That there'd be cases where soldiers would get a brief furlough and they would go to a local cantina or bar and they'd be stabbed to death by a Mexican civilian. But so to an extent, he wanted to try to placate the Mexican people as an occupying army and try to make them feel as if they were being heard as far as the injustices that Americans were inflicting upon them. And then also Winfield Scott had a very kind of a sanctimonious reputation, kind of a holier than thou reputation, that God was with him and God gave him his victories, and that he couldn't spoil God's favor by allowing his men to act wickedly. So he's going to have a lot of his own men executed. The primary account is of raping Mexican women. So at any rate, you see that. Then when you look at Chicano historians, lastly, right, after the war, notice some of the sources I cite at the end there. Occupied America by Rodolfo Acuna, and also I think of Our America by Felipe Fernandez Armesto. Those books are just laden with example after example of Latinos in the far West, right, facing atrocities, and not just atrocities, but inequities, right, things that were unfair. And so I try to give examples of that, of during the gold rush, especially, right, of violence against Latinos, and then violent wars coming back from Latinos as well, like Joaquin Murrieta and Gregorio Cortina and others. And then also the term, which might be on the next test, is proletarianization. Okay, recall that, it's down in there, and I italicized it. And remember, the proletariat is Marxist notion of the modern industrialized working class, the urban workers, the manual laborers that work with their hands, right? And connected to the industrial economy. And so that the idea is that Mexican Americans circumstantially and culturally were kind of pigeonholed into the proletariat, right? That the only available jobs for them were working as common laborers for a corporate mining company, a corporate railroad company, um, or on a corporate ranch or farm, right? And so they tended to be kind of pigeonholed into those areas. And then if it's not bad enough that circumstantially those tend to be the only areas, only jobs that were available to them, two other things compounded this inequity. One was the glass ceiling. There were no actual laws in the state legislators that I'm aware of. There were no actual bylaws amongst the corporations that stated that you can't give a promotion to a Latino worker, but they just simply didn't do it, right? And that's a term, glass ceiling is a term they most often use for women. It's very often, right? No actual laws or bylaws that state women should not be paid the same as men, but they just don't pay them the same as men. And so hence the term glass ceiling, right? You can't see it, but you know it's there. And so there not only was a glass ceiling in these jobs, right? But then there was a cultural stereotype that stated that that's where they belonged, right? And excuse me for the poor, silly analogy, but imagine like actor Will Ferrell playing like in a serious, I don't know, a serious romantic movie, or or playing as an alpha male in a shoot 'em up movie, right? Like we kind of laugh, like, come on now, that's Will Ferrell. He doesn't belong there. And so that's how, that's what happens is you become stigmatized. And that's what happened to Latinos is they said, oh, Latinos are simple minded. They're kind of creatures of habit and of their own instincts. But they're good at manual labor. So hence that's where they belong, right? That's what society claims is their spot, right? In society. And sadly, right, you see vestiges of this to this very day. Anytime my family goes to Carmel, I know I could pretty much count on the fact that I could work on my Spanish with those who are cleaning the rooms. And certain what they would call menial jobs are still largely occupied by Hispanic laborers or Latino laborers. So at any rate, they contend that there's evidence for that in the mid to late 1800s, that Latino people were kind of pigeonholed into the proletariat, into jobs that didn't have much of a future as far as promotion or high pay or advancement. And they were culturally, they were stigmatized as that they belong in that sector of the economy and in that sector alone. Okay. So are there any questions? Any questions or comments on either of these two numbers on the West before the Civil War? All right, and I have everyone's name. Yeah, it says 6. I have 5 names. 6 includes me. So Priscilla, Christina, Kimberly, Andrea, Amanda. So I have everyone, right?
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, if you guys don't have any other questions, just message me on Canvas. Okay. We're getting to the end. We're going to do one that on the alleged causes of the Civil War. Then we'll do the Civil War itself. Then we'll do Reconstruction, and we're done with the semester. Crazy, huh? And thank you so much for your patience with grading. Okay.
Yeah, it
I'm
seems like it went
definitely
by really, really fast.
I'm definitely going to try to catch up on grading. Okay. It has though, hasn't it, Amanda? All right. So if there are any other questions, you guys, I'll go ahead and I have everyone down. I'll give you extra credit on this assignment. I'll pad your grades for this. Okay. And just keep in touch with me via Canvas Messenger. And and I'll go ahead and bid you guys adieu, okay? But thank you so much. I really appreciate those of you who are able to make it and choose to do so. Like I said, I definitely want to intend to reward you for this. And I appreciate you guys hanging in there. All right, so have
Have
a
a
good
good
week.
day.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you. Bye-bye.